Hello, and welcome to this latest episode of the Energy Insiders podcast. My name is Charles Parkinson. I'm the editor-in-chief of Renew Economy and editor of its EV-focused sister site, The Driven. And on the road, struggling with some lousy internet connections, but joining me nonetheless is ITK Principal David Leach. David, I trust you and your stuffed animal are well.
I am well, Giles. I've been watching too much TV, I think, but this little fellow approves of nearly everything I say. It's nearly as good as the Mirror in terms of approval ratings. But anyway, we've got a great guest today.
Oh, we do have a very good guest. He was very patient with us with our problems because of my lousy internet. We managed to catch up with Federal Energy and Climate Minister Chris Bowen, just back from New York, where he's been at the United Nations and visiting other places. Let's have a listen. If you're wondering why I'm silent, it's because my microphone stopped working. But David carried the day. Let's have a listen. Chris Bowen, welcome back to the Energy Insiders podcast, and a debut, I think, this time with video. Look, it's so much to talk about. The new emissions targets, the progress of the capacity investment scheme, your trip to New York, the United Nations, negotiations over the UN climate conference COP31 next year. Let's start off with the news of the day, though. Rio Tinto has announced the early closure of the Gladstone coal-fired power station. It's a 50-year-old power station. It's not a complete surprise, but the timing seems to be, I'd say, exquisite or interesting. I'm coming a week before the Queensland government's energy plan, which seems, if you listen to some of the LNP members of Parliament, is going to be focused on coal only. What do you make of it?
So, I mean, firstly, thanks, Giles. Good to see you and you, David. This is a decision by CIS Energy and Rio Tinto. It's the first thing to say. I think, secondly, it underlines, I think, the need for more renewable investment in Queensland. There's been some setbacks recently, to be frank. I don't make a habit of, criticising state governments for no reason, but there's been some setbacks in Queensland. Minister Janetsky, I think, has a very good approach, but across the Queensland government in total, there's been some poor decisions. So that I think endangers Queensland government's ability to meet targets and endangers energy reliability, because we all know one coal-fired power stations will close. There'll be some brought forward, some delayed, but they're all going to close at some point. And secondly, they're unreliable. Now, the Queensland fleet is younger than the rest of the country, but still getting older. So I think that's. And I guess my final point is, if you read the newspapers, it's all all the coal-fired power stations in Queensland were about to be extended by a long period. Well, actually, on a closer examination of the facts, that's not necessarily the case.
And it seems to be a fairly emphatic statement by the biggest energy consumer in the state, and the company responsible for the smelters and the refineries, that really renewables are the future for these assets and not fossil fuels.
And Giles, it's probably worth, just before Chris goes on, mentioning that Rio has said that if the Queensland government or someone doesn't like it, that they're open to a discussion on it. I just don't want to exclude that comment, because I think it is important in the context.
Yeah.
They might have their hat out for more money or something like that. But it does seem to be sort of a difference, a bit of a difference there between some of the biggest consumers in Australia about what they think about what they want to consume in terms of energy, and some governments.
Well, absolutely. Big energy consumers know that renewables are the cheapest form of energy, and they're the future. Now, it's complicated when you get to things like smelters. Of course, it's complicated, but the fundamental laws of economics remain the same.
Yeah. The question is, though, I guess, if Gladstone is going to close by 2029, that you get enough of this new capacity built. Now, that's probably a matter for Rio Tinto and also for the Queensland government in terms of state approvals and things like that. You are responsible, or you have set a target of 82% renewables by 2030. And, there's a lot of debate now about whether we're going to get there or just get close or whatever. Capacity investment scheme, are you sort of happy with the way that's sort of rolling out? It's almost a year now since the first tender winners were announced. I think we might get one, or the first one to reach financial close, or the second one maybe to reach financial close. Do you need to do anything else to get these things over the line?
Well, firstly, yes, I am happy with how the capacity investment scheme is working. It's massively oversubscribed, which shows me that the pipeline of projects is big and strong. And that's why one of the reasons why we extended it from 32 gigawatts to 40. One, yes, that was an indication we needed to do more, but two, it was a sign of strength that the pipeline is so strong that we could very easily support 40 gigawatts. I released the 10 to 3 results just a couple of weeks ago. 16 projects, 4.1 gigawatts, 15 gigawatt hours of dispatchable capacity. I mean, very big chunks. That's just in one auction. I'll be releasing the results of the generation auction imminently, quite soon. We're supporting a lot of very good projects. Now, it hasn't yet hit the grid. Like, these are big scale things. We're just getting our first electrons, very early electrons out of the first project supported in auction 1, which seems like a long, long time ago. So it's yet to have an impact on the grid and yet to reflect in our renewable energy figures. But it'll be a very, very important part of getting to 82% by 2030, which I'm still, I am not writing off. I am still confident we can achieve from 2025 to 2030. A lot of work to do, but, I'm confident we can achieve it alongside everything that's happening in the small scale. To your question, do we need to do more? Well, of course, it's no secret we're engaging in planning reform and EPBC reform. There's SIDS projects still waiting for environmental approvals. We've got to get to yes or no more quickly. Murray Watt is doing a great job working on that, and I'm confident he'll get some reforms through this year. We've got more work to do with the states, and we've got more work to do on connections, et cetera, but we're doing that work, is my point. So yes, I'm very pleased with the capacity investment scheme. It's working, if anything, better than I anticipated, and I thought it would work pretty well.
I'd like to come back to the Gladstone closure that's been announced, because in fact, if we just get away from the CIS for a moment, and we'll come back to it no doubt, Chris, but there's so much going on generally in decarbonisation. And there are a number of federal government schemes in relation to big business. The aluminium production credit, the Net Zero Fund has $5 billion. The production aluminium one has $2 billion, and the Powering the Regions have $1.9 billion. That's nearly $10 billion of available funding, or $9 billion. I can't add up. Let's not worry about that. That's what comes from being an accountant. But not much of that money's been actually accessed yet. And I'm just wondering how it fits in if we pick an area like Gladstone and what's going on up there. Do you see it all coming together, and what's the attitude of the big companies that actually, the manufacturers that actually own the facilities that would be taking advantage of this?
Yeah, it does take time to roll this stuff out, and we've got to get it right. And a lot of the part of it, our design, you say, hasn't been accessed yet, but a lot of the design of our programs is based on success. You don't actually receive support until you're producing. That's deliberate. We don't want to make speculative offers with taxpayers' money. But you referred to a few with all our green metals initiatives. Obviously, that's accompanied alongside Hydrogen Head Start, which is supporting Murchison and Orica. Powering the Regions Fund, money has flowed out of that, which is supporting decarbonisation, including some significant projects in Gladstone. So, I see these projects as very important for the industrial future, not only of Gladstone, but in due course, the Hunter and other places where the economic change is inevitable, but we can create, new job opportunities building on strength. And I think, that'll play out over the course of the next 5 years or so.
There's been quite a lot of debate about old industries versus new industries. If I was to talk about, like data centers, which has a lot of hopium in them in some ways, because they don't actually exist in Australia to any great extent yet. And yet we've also got all these old industries that we're trying to keep going, even as in some cases, like the mining resources, like iron ore quantity in West Australia is going down. I mean, and there's global competition. This is a normal thing. I don't know. It's not really your job as the energy minister, but do you have a view on to what extent we should be supporting existing older manufacturing like aluminium smelters and say Tomago versus pushing forward into new areas?
Well, without getting into details of any particular company, there's always going to be a mix, but we are very much focused on jobs of the future. as well as, supporting particular companies who might be in a particular situation at a particular time. But if you look at green metals, hydrogen head start, solar sunshot, battery breakthrough, this is all about jobs of the future. It's all about seeing opportunities. Obviously, new industries sometimes need a bit of assistance in the early stages to get cracking. It's particularly in keeping with the approach of other governments around the world. So, I do think, certainly in my portfolio, the main focus is on seeing those opportunities and making sure we can seize them.
Chris, let's come back and talk about the CIS. I also want to talk about EVs and carrots versus sticks approaches, which I've been reading about a little bit, and it's an interesting sort of angle. But the CIS, we've had a lot of projects announced and some very, very early 1 or 2 small solar projects, which I think had actually already commenced prior to the first CIS energy tender. But a lot of the big wind projects, it seems they need to get going now to get anywhere near to our 80% target in 2030. And I'm just wondering, there seems in the review that was that's been done of the electricity markets, like the industry structure of the big gentailers wasn't really addressed, and there don't seem to be many contracts being struck, the CIS awards, but then nothing happens. I'm just wondering how you're thinking about that. What can you do to make the CIS more effective? Is it the case that prices have to go up in it, or what?
No, as I said, I think the CIS takes time just inevitably to work because you're supporting large utility scale projects, unlike something we might touch on cheaper home batteries. That's a very different scale with, a lot of electrons already, 3 months in, as opposed to CIS, which is big scale, not many electrons yet, but there will be a lot of electrons between now and 2030. Your point about the gentailers, obviously, I encourage everyone to invest as much as possible, but we are seeing signs of progress. So, I think it was just yesterday, we saw AGL with Tilt, a 15-year PPA for the Palmer Wind Farm in South Australia. Great. Origin's working away on Yanco Delta, good. And I'm not, obviously, chief executives tell me confidentially their plans and I don't disclose them. But, I will say in the broad, plenty of energy companies are telling me about their plans to support onshore wind and solar in coming months. And that's a good thing. Yes, they need to get cracking. Absolutely. They need, to get planning approval and FID, etc. But, I see a lot, I'm starting to see a lot more. But wind has been, facing some challenges over the last few months, but we're starting to see, I think, more coming through.
I have a couple of little questions on that. I guess one is just generally, how confident are you feeling about the 80% target, and do you, it's become a target, and do you think that that you might have to pull policy levers harder or differently to get there?
So I think we're getting on with it. As I said, the CIS hasn't really impacted on the renewable energy figures yet at all. Wouldn't expect it to have because the projects have to be built. But they're all coming forward. The vast majority of them are proceeding in some form. Likewise, small scale is going absolute gangbusters. So as of today, when we're recording 72,000 cheaper home batteries since the 1st of July.
Do you happen to have that must be getting close to a gigawatt, more than a gigawatt hour?
More than a gigawatt hour. We surpassed a gigawatt hour about a fortnight ago. I think we're up to about 1.3 or 1.4 gigawatt hours now. So that's big, right? And interestingly, David, roughly is 50-50. 50% of the cheaper home batteries are being installed retrofitted to existing solar arrays on roofs, and 50% are people putting solar on for the first time. So it's not only is it massively increasing the storage, but it's increasing the generation as well, because there's a bunch of people evidently who've said, well, I didn't see the point of solar without a battery, but now that I can get a cheap home battery, I'm going to do solar as well. So it's driving both. And so that's good. That you are going to start to see that reflected in the quarterly figures of renewable energy penetration, and that's going to be pretty important to get us to 82. As I said, yes, I'm optimistic, but more than that, I'm determined, to keep going. And, the easiest thing to do is to sit around like Stadler and Waldorf and write in the Australian that we're not going to get to 82%. I mean, that's the easiest role to play in the energy transition. Anyone can do that. Rolling up your sleeves, as so many of us are doing, not just me, but industry and across governments to get the job done, is the harder side of it, but the much more rewarding, dare I say.
I could not agree more with that statement. I mean, it's generally to achieve something, it's a lot of hard work and you've got to pass a lot of milestones, obstacles, etc. I completely and 100% agree with that. I just want to ask one more question about the CIS, because I'm sure we're going to see some more contract announcements in this month, I do believe. But if I was to there's been a big debate in the industry because the costs of wind have gone up and planning approvals are slow and community resistance is stronger to wind than it is to solar, that maybe the mix in Australia has to change going forward. Do you take account of that do the people who look at the CIS awards and decide what's the best value for Australian consumers, how do they think about that kind of thing?
Well, what they do look at the mix, but, and they give me a recommendation. And of course, I have accepted every single recommendation made to me by ASL and my department. So, I don't go through the individual projects myself and make allocations under the CIS. I accept the advice given to me and I sign it off. There's a solar cap, as you know, in Victoria. But apart from that, they judge the projects on their merits. What comes to me is a pretty good mix. And ultimately, the market, will determine that, David. Yes, the cost of solar has come down dramatically. Wind has faced some cost challenges. But, ultimately, we need both, of course. They have played complementary roles in our grid, different and complementary roles. Obviously, wind is very important in the evenings. And will continue to be. So, but as I said, some like the AGL's announcement yesterday, Yanko Delta Origin working away, and that's just two examples. There's plenty of people working on other big wind that I'm aware of. Again, I'm not going to make announcements for them. That's theirs to announce, but I'm aware of the work that's going on, and it's pretty encouraging.
Good. I just want to ask two more questions about that, and then one about EVs. I guess the one about, obviously, the attitude of states towards, we've talked a little bit about the Queensland government, but there's been an issue in Victoria as well, where offshore wind has been slowed down. And, in my opinion, the Victorian transmission build-out, particularly VNI West and the Western Renewables link, is going very slowly. This is just my comment as industry comment. I'm just wondering how does that play into things?
Well, offshore wind was obviously never part of our 2030 targets, and always was going to be a slow build. And yes, it's facing challenges around the world. So I remain, upbeat about its long-term future for Australia as the world's largest island. I've heard your comments many times, and despite your scurrilous accusation in last couple of weeks, I do listen to every podcast, David. So I'm right across your views that you've expressed.
And no doubt a lot of other people's views who are far better informed than me, Chris.
Yes, but I've heard your comments on offshore wind, and, fair enough. I respect them. But I think it's got a role to play because, it is particularly windy offshore. It's particularly windy at night. It's an important complement to all the embroidery of renewables and the other, and gas and all the batteries. So, but yes, due to a range of international factors, it's facing challenges. But it was never, absolutely sort of essential to our 2030 or our 2035 targets. It's more a longer term proposition.
And I guess I would just say, are you happy with the state of the transmission build-out? Because a few years ago, transmission was seen as the number one problem, whereas to my mind, at least in New South Wales, it's costly, it's expensive, etc. But transmission in New South Wales and Queensland, even in Gladstone, there's now a plan to, it seems to be going sort of okay.
Yeah. We're getting on with it. Again, there's, of course, inevitably on a big projects like these, you're going to find some delays. But, Humlick, for example, has now reached landholder agreement with 98% of the landholders, with Transgrid. That's pretty good, right? That means they are now basically ready to go, ready to get cracking. Well done, Transgrid, getting on with it. PEC, we know has faced challenges, but, we'll be delivering electrons in the not too distant future. We just keep going. These are necessary projects guided by the ISP, which I think is world's best practice. The ISP will adjust to change circumstances, but ultimately, as well as we're doing on small scale and rooftop and batteries, and we're doing very, very well there, we're still going to need, despite the comments of Christine Milne, we're still going to need big stuff as well.
I think we are, and I won't even ask about Basslink in that context. It's just I want to avoid the idea. Marinus Link, sorry.
Marinus. Well, I mean, there you've got three governments working well together to deliver a very important nation-building project. There hasn't been much new renewables in Tasmania for the last couple of years. Why? Because effectively they need Marinus to make them stack up.
I agree with that, and it's got a great wind resource, arguably as good as or better than the offshore wind resource. But anyway, that's a matter of detail. I just wanted to come back to the EV side of things and reference the carrot and stick, because on the stick side of things, we've got the new vehicle efficiency standards, which will require over time, they're very easy to start with the manufacturers to bring in more electric cars, but it was pointed out by someone that I respect on LinkedIn that creating demand for EVs is making consumers want them is probably the thing that gets going. I mean, it gets to a point, I think a lot about psychology and identity theory and stuff. I mean, it's sort of seemingly abstruse topics, but when everyone in your suburb's got an EV and you're the odd one out, then it's a lot easier to be the one that makes the switch. And at the moment, we've only got the really financial lease incentive, the novated lease, which kind of appeals to, the people that live in my suburb, Linfield.
Well, actually, it's funny you say that, David, because the novated lease, the electric vehicle tax cut, and as you said correctly, novated lease is actually the biggest take-up is Rouse Hill, Kellyville, and Blacktown.
Is that right?
Yeah.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Your electorate.
My electorate adjacent. More Greenway and certainly Western Sydney, which is my hometown.
Politics works as always, not deliberately in this case, I might say. But I mean, more broadly, what about the incentive structure in EVs? And I don't mean just endless more government subsidies, but creating consumer demand. I'm just wondering about that generally, how we can do that.
Well, I think you do need both, and we do have both, in my view. The electric vehicle tax cut, which is also a tariff tax cut as well as the novated lease. The tariff tax cut applies, of course, across the board. It's only 5%, but still, it makes a difference. Together with the new vehicle efficiency standards. Now, the new vehicle efficiency standards, again, haven't yet impacted on emissions, but I tell you what that has impacted on is choice. We are about to see an absolute explosion in choice for Australian motorists as a result of the new vehicle efficiency standards. There are brands and models coming to Australia that, most Australians have not yet heard of, that they'll just start to see populating the streets. And there's cheap ones, there's expensive ones, there's lower range, there's higher range, there's big cars, there's little cars, there'll be something for everyone. And that's what it was always all about, driving more choice. So let's let it work. It's only come in on the 1st of July, in effect, 1st of January softly and 1st of July hard. But, I've spoken to manufacturers who said, yep, we're setting models now to Australia across the efficiency standards we weren't going to send before. So let's give it a go and let's let that choice explode and see how Australians respond. In addition, you've got to deal with range anxiety. There's figures showing, I think it's 30% of Australians would like an EV for the next car, but they haven't made the final decision to do it because there's still many.
Chris, I had that discussion in our house. We've got 2 EVs and one of them's got a bigger battery than the other because one member in our household has range anxiety, even though the reality is I do all the long distance driving and I'm not the one with range anxiety.
Because you said like me, you don't have range anxiety because like me, I use my EV to drive back and forth to Canberra. Not the world's longest drive, but not the world's shortest either.
No. You need a decent battery. Look, just moving along because I know I want to hand back to Giles very shortly, but the other area of policy, the original area of policy, and again it relates to these schemes that are available, is the Emissions Reduction Fund. In its first year, I think I saw it only got only a 2 million tonne reduction, and it's up for review in this next 12 months. Without prejudging the review, what do you think the aims of it should be?
Sorry, are you referring to not quite following the safeguard reform?
The safeguard schemes. Excuse me, I getting old. Apologies.
No, not at all. I'm very happy the way safeguard reforms have worked, David. Those emissions reductions on site in the first year. So I'm not counting offsets here. Offsets are a bonus. In the first year, the emissions reduction in safeguard facilities has been a third of Australian domestic aviation emissions in 1 year. That's not nothing in the first year, right? And then on top of that, then you get offsets for those companies who are not yet able to reduce emissions on site for technical or commercial reasons. But ultimately, their boards and their chief executives are going to say, well, hang on, why are we buying all these offsets? Wouldn't it be better if we invest in on-site emissions reduction as the technology becomes available? So, yes, there is a review next year because by then it will be operating for a couple of years and we'll have another set of figures to assess it. There'll be all sorts of views about, allowing more offsets, less offsets, et cetera, and how trade-exposed industries are dealt with. And there'll be a genuine review. Like after a couple of years, as it will then be, we'll be able to assess how it's going and what tweaks are necessary. But I'm going to push back very hard on the argument that because offsets are allowed somehow, it doesn't work. On-site emissions reduction, not counting offsets, a third of Australia's aviation emissions, pretty bloody good start.
I agree, but I doubt it's going to be in the gas industry. That's just my comment. And
But the thing is, for right or for wrong, I think for right, we took the existing safeguard architecture because it was, I always think things are easier and faster if you take an existing infrastructure and architecture rather than designing something from scratch. That covers the 215 biggest emitters. You've got aviation, gas, bauxite, aluminium, steel, coal, trucking, the whole lot. They're all different, cement, and they all have different abatement opportunities. Some are easier than others. So you've got to give them a bit of flexibility as they achieve that 4.9% emissions reduction we require a year.
And so I think, well, let me just hand back to Giles now.
You were in Detroit just recently looking at some white spots on the road, the wireless charging. What did you make of that?
I thought it was fascinating. Now, it probably won't be a wide-scale solution. For those who didn't see that, I was in Detroit with Governor Whitmer, and they are Ford and the Detroit authorities are working on this trial of charging while you drive. So sort of a bit like, as they explained it to me, it's like when you put your mobile phone on one of those, chargers, which you don't plug in, you just put it on top. When you drive over these chargers, you'll get a bit of a charge up into the car. Now, it's obviously an expensive way to do it to start with, and it won't be on every road, far from it. But you can conceive high traffic routes, particularly where there's, a lot of delivery trucks, which will become electric, for example, it playing some sort of a role. Now, we're not proposing it here in Australia, but I just found I thought it was a very interesting innovation that there in Detroit, the home of, the traditional American car industry, they're putting chargers into the roads to charge cars as they drive on top of them.
You were in America for the United Nations climate meeting. What did you make of, you heard one day Donald Trump and calling everything a climate hoax, and the next day you saw China with its first emissions reduction targets, a target of 3,600 gigawatts of wind and solar, which actually sounded small.
Yeah. That's right. Well, I think, David, it's the best of times and the worst of times in the international scene at the moment. You've got a big political debate. I'm not going to comment on, other countries, even United States in detail. But, clearly climate denial is back in some places. That's the matter for them. But you've got the political debate is probably not in a great space around the world. But you are seeing a lot of governments getting on with it. I spent time with the British, the Germans, right across the board, the Canadians, everyone's just getting on with it. And that's reflected in the investment decisions. Renewables will surpass coal this year as the world's largest source of power. That doesn't happen by accident. It happens because of big investments that have occurred and are occurring as we speak. $2 trillion of investment in renewables. Renewables now employ more people than fossil fuels, and double the investment in renewables and fossil fuels. And next year, wind and solar separately will overtake nuclear because nuclear investment is, of course, anemic and renewables investment is so strong. So there's a lot happening. The world is getting on with all this nonsense about the rest of the world isn't doing it. So why should we? I mean, don't even get me started on the intellectual dishonesty of that argument. But ultimately, it's not even true. The rest of the world is getting on with it. And China, China installs in any given month more renewable capacity than our entire fleet, and in any given year, more than the United States fleet.
And by the way, you can see a decline despite the millions of people employed in the coal mining industry in China and its interrelated coal generation industry. You can quite clearly see, based on IEA data, a decline in coal generation now. That may only be seasonal. It's happened before, but to me, it looks like a clear trend is actually developing in the statistics I look at.
I think that's right, David. Again, it's a false argument that people run here. Matt Canavan analysts say, look, China's building all these coal-fired power stations. We should too. Well, by and large, the coal-fired power stations that China is building are replacing old capacity. Now, would it be wonderful if they were doing all of it renewables? Sure, but their renewable investment dwarfs their new coal, absolutely dwarfs their new coal, and the new coal is simply just keeping up with some old coal retiring. It's not adding to the coal mix in China. On the contrary, as you said, it's falling.
It's avoiding the fight that will come there, as in every country, between coal and renewable generation, because demand for electricity is increasing. So coal is standing still or declining a little bit, which they can manage, and renewables is gaining all the incremental market share. Giles, I'm interrupting you. Sorry.
No, that's okay. I'm just wondering, is Australia going to be able to host the UN climate conference next year?
Well, the situation remains, Giles, as it has for some time, that Australia's bid has overwhelming support of the world, overwhelming support, but that's not the way the COP process works. It's got to be unanimous. That means one country can veto us, and the most obvious country that would veto us is the country that is competing against us. So we're trying to avoid that situation by talking to them. I'm not going to go into the details about what in those conversations involve, but they're respectful and positive and constructive. And how it will result, I can't tell you because I don't know just yet. But they're being held at a very senior level, and it would be good to have it resolved in such a way that Turkey sees an outcome that they can live with, and the COP is in Australia, and Australia is the COP president. So watch this space. It may or may not pan out that way. But we're working on it.
Just finally from me, the emissions reduction target, 62 to 70%. You said we couldn't aim higher. Do you think it's possible that we might do better?
Look, I think a couple of things. Firstly, it is, as I've said many times, ambitious and achievable. I took the view, based on Climate Change Authority advice. If you look at the Climate Change Authority advice, they say a target higher than 70 would lead to unacceptable economic, social, and environmental short-term costs. I wasn't prepared to make those costs. It's been very widely and positively received around the world. There's not one minister from another country in New York who said to me that target should be higher. Ministers around the world said that is a good, solid target, including the Pacific. Vanuatu had comments, but then, you also had comments from Palau at the UN General Assembly praising our target. It is ambitious. It involves a halving of emissions from today. That's not easy. It's equivalent of taking transport out twice. So we talked a bit about transport and some of the challenges. We've got to abolish transport emissions twice between now and 2035 to get to 62. Now, if the country leans in or continues to lean in as they have, certainly we can go for the top of the range. Absolutely. Because really, I'm being honest in saying the federal government is the most important player and has the most important levers, but not all the levers. Others have levers too. If the states continue to lean in and help and do great work, if business leans in and industry leans in, if households continue to lean in and put 1,000 batteries in a day, then sure, let's aim for right at the top of the target. But it's also important that it had to be a target that I could put my hand on my heart and say, I believe we can achieve. That's also important for the markets. If the international markets and investors look at the target and say, oh, look, it's too high to be credible, it's going to backfire. It has to be a credible target that people look at, because the whole idea of a target is to say to renewable energy investors, come and invest here. This is what we're trying to achieve. Here's some policy certainty. Here's a target. Come and help us do it. If they look at that target and say, well, 85% or 80%, 75%, I don't see how Australia can get there. that's going to backfire on the country. So it's got to be credible. I believe it is. I'm very happy with the way it's been received.
Under promise, over deliver. It's the absolute unbeaten, undisputed recipe for success. But that brings me back to the 82% target, because you'll get a lot of bets against that target being achieved at the moment, Chris. So when I talk around the industry, I mean, that's just what my feeling about that target. Do you need to press any more policy levers or do something? I mean, like, is the CIS, it provides a developer incentive, but it doesn't provide any stick for gentailers in the way that renewable energy certificates force them to actually do something. But there's no force, no compulsion on that end of it at the moment.
No, but they are participating. Energy Australia has done well out of the CIS. They've got projects that are receiving support, and they've done a great job to their credit. Again, I won't go into details about what others are planning, but I know that they're looking at applying for CIS, and whether they get on or not depends on their bids and how good they are. But there are big companies that have that are working on proposals to come into the CIS. So the CIS is working well. As I said before, it hasn't yet impacted on the renewable figures. We're just getting a few electrons out of the very first project. But over the next 5 years, we certainly will. And, that's in addition to the big boost in small scale, which is the easier policy lever to push, because it's the nudge, the encouragement, and Australians have shown they respond very quickly. 1,000 batteries a day, 72,000 as of today. That's a lot. We're getting a lot more electrons out of that than we are out of the CIS as we speak. But over the 5 years and then the 10 years, both will come into play.
I do think on the EV side, a broader consumer appeal. I'm not in favour of endless subsidies. I don't know anyone that is. But I mean, we have a policy. We don't have a carbon price. The cost of not having a carbon price is you have to provide incentives in lots of other different fields in a less efficient way, I would argue, overall. Many economists would say the same. But it's the CIS. I do worry about the CIS in the sense that, not one of the big wind projects. This still seems to be quite hard. The PBC reform process, I mean, it's not going to really be of much use in terms of achieving 2030 targets, is it? Because most of the projects that are going to have to go into the EBCB, I mean, they've got to be started within 12 or 18 months, and to be operating by 2030.
Well, but there's also there's lots of projects that are in the EPBC process right now. So I don't want to sort of venture into Murray Watt's area, but he's working on the reforms. If he gets those through, I'd be hopeful that it'd be starting to have an impact sooner rather than later.
Minister, I think we're going to have to wrap it up there. We do appreciate your time, and thanks once again for coming back to the Energy Insiders podcast.
Great chat. We'll do it again before the end of the year, eh?
You're listening to the Energy Insiders podcast with Giles Parkinson and David Leach. And David, thank you very much for holding the fort while I ran around and stuffed around with my internet and my microphone issue.
Well, Giles, I think it's more the case. Thanks very much to the Minister for putting up with us and our questions. And, it's great to hear, frankly, because there is a lot going on in different areas and only a limited amount of time to run around. And sometimes I think when we're talking partisan stuff, you actually miss the underlying detail of what's going on in a wide variety of programs.
Yeah, look, and I think it's important that that the minister is still pretty confident of reaching these 82% renewable targets. I think there's some doubt about whether we'll get there. I rather fancy that what we might end up having is probably enough capacity commissioned or in construction to meet that target, but maybe not quite delivered at that particular time. But even that would be a great thing. But we're starting to see a little bit of movement, as was mentioned in the interview with a Palmer Wind Farm. We're starting to see a few things with BHP. We're starting to see some other movement elsewhere. Even Origin's put in an application now for its wind farm up at New England. Not that that's going to.
Well, there are two of those, Giles. There are two wind farms immediately adjacent to each other. Their boundaries are aligned. And that's one by Squadron and one by Origin. And one's called the Booralong Wind Farm, which is where I've caught trout. A great little place for catching trout. And they're both out along the Warrani Road, which is where I'll be heading this weekend for my model plane New South Wales State Championships in the F5J. So I got a very good view of that particular location. I think there are things to lots and lots of things to sort out about wind and its costs, and it's pretty important that we do get them sorted out. Today we saw an announcement from Rio that it's looking at an early closure of the Gladstone power station, and whilst that will come as no surprise to anyone who follows the industry, and whilst it's not confirmed by Rio, as we discussed on the podcast, I mean, they're open to keeping it open longer if someone will offer them a nice sweet deal like Yallourn or Origin or someone gets, and like apparently AGL's going to get in South Australia. Nevertheless, it shows how important it is to get on with the replacement, and we can be thankful that Powerlink's already got a plan for developing new transmission. And I think the closure of Gladstone will open up the opportunities for things like the Theodore Wind Farm, for Clark Creek Stage 2, and a whole bunch of stuff to get the go-ahead in Queensland.
And I just love the timing of what they did, just coming a week before the Queensland LNP government announced its energy plan. So that will make them think, perhaps, maybe. We'll have to see.
Well, and why? Just it's probably worth people. Not everyone may know that Gladstone Power Station, one way or another, gets a subsidy from CIS Energy, so from the Queensland government, and to the tune of $50 to $100 million a year. And so I guess one interpretation of what Rio is saying is that deal's coming to an end around 2029. Do you guys want to kick it down the road a bit more? I mean, I don't mean to be, I certainly hope the power station closes because I think it's in the best interests of everyone in Queensland. But just to point out that there's probably more water to flow under the bridge.
Well, it's very similar actually to what Origin did with Eraring, really. Announced an early closure, about 6 years earlier than previously planned, and then sat and watched the New South Wales government fretted and eventually sort of offered them some an underwriting deal in the end, which they haven't touched. But it's the same sort of. I mean, is it similar? I don't know.
It's not quite as similar because Gladstone's not really all that profitable, in my opinion, and capacity utilisation's been going down every year. And Rio has its own ESG, it has its shareholders pressure Rio in the same way they pressure every big company. Those pressures may wax and wane from CEO to CEO and year to year, but the underlying pressure is the same way. I mean, just this afternoon we saw that South Korea is actually looking at banning petrol and diesel cars, ICE cars, from 2035, the same as Europe does. And whereas what happens in Europe is sort of to the average working Australian might be of academic interest because they're not all driving European cars, but there's a hell of a lot of Kias and Hyundais on the road. So there's still a lot of straws in the wind. I'm talking a lot, but we've seen coal production is clearly on the decline at the moment, as I mentioned in the interview in China. Coal fuel generation, I mean to say. And so, in Australia's coal exports are actually down. We're losing market share to Indonesia, not for climate reasons. There's plenty of reasons to get on with replacing our traditional industries with the new ones.
Yeah, that's right. And so Rio is also under pressure from its customers, which is interesting. Just turning to AGL and its Torrens B power station. I mean, no surprise there that it was extended, I suppose. Shame we don't know how much money AGL is going to get, but they're always going to get something because they made a point of saying that it's not making them any money. So to keep it open for a couple of years longer will cost the South Australian government money. The South Australian government, the State Energy Minister, Tom Koutsantonis, is really not a big fan of Project Energy Connect, the new transmission line. Calls it the extension cord to nowhere and says, I told you so. So anyway,
New South Wales probably is nowhere from South Australia's point of view. But for a lot of the rest of Australia, it's a fairly important state.
Anyway, but anyway, look, that's all interesting. Look, there's a lot of battery news that has come our way this week. One thing we forgot to mention last week was Snowy Hydro actually signing up to its first big battery, which I thought was quite interesting. That's the Elaine battery in Victoria. It's got a virtual transmission agreement with that one. So this week we've had AGL registering its Liddell battery at the site of the Liddell generator. That's just over 2 years after that coal-fired power station closed. We've got the first stage of the supernode battery in Queensland, which will eventually be the biggest in the country, and largely contracted to Origin, but also to Stanwell. The first stage is registration as well. We've got NEON completing what is now the country's biggest battery at Collie, 2,240 megawatt hours, 4 months ahead of schedule, and starting its contract as the solar soaker, and then starting construction on its first 6-hour battery just north of Perth, and it's got a couple of other battery and wind projects also over in Western Australia.
So we
and New South Wales and New South Wales setting the wheels in motion for its sort of supplementary tender, I suppose you could call it, 500 megawatts, just to make sure it can fill in that gap if and when Eraring closes in 2027.
Yes, so there's still plenty of room for those batteries because power prices are still going negative every day here in spring at least, which is a sure sign there's still too much capacity in the middle of the day. But I think the main point there is that the batteries are all tending now to commission, or seem to be commissioning fairly smoothly and on time. And that's in contrast if we look at some of these wind farms. They're still taking a long time to get up to speed, which is yet another thing to think about. So I think
that's interesting. Well, particularly with the you've got the McIntyre wind farm up in Queensland, 923 megawatts. That's still only at about a third of the way through, as far as I can see. So I'm not too sure what the issue is there.
Gold Plains is just hitting its straps now. I think it's got to 700 megawatts or whatever, and so we are seeing records regularly in terms of both curtailment and in terms of renewable energy production and. Every spring, and electricity prices fall and things look wonderful at this time of year. Not always so much in June, but anyway.
Yeah, indeed. And we can look forward to the results of the next generation tender. The minister described it as imminent. I'm not too sure what time.
I am looking forward to those results. I am looking forward to seeing some of these big wind projects get to financial closure, final investment decision. I think they really need to get there over the next 12 months. Lots, gigawatts of the stuff. And then there's the question that we probably come to about the actual execution and delivery about the New South Wales roads project, and questions like how many turbines can you actually deliver a week? I mean, they're the questions that are going to be, how many records can we set there, in a good way? Like how efficient can we actually be at this kind of stuff? Execution, right? It's one thing to once we actually start this program and start rolling out gigawatts, execution and doing a good job, like, the US did in building up its production of planes in World War II. I mean, that's an example of how you can go from nothing to an absolutely massive industry in the space of 2 or 3 years where there was a will and a way.
One other thing I'd like to mention is Fortescue's decision this week, or announcement that it's signing deals with BYD for batteries, and interestingly, Envision for wind turbines, which is going to pair with the Nabra wind self-lifting technology, which we sort of discussed a couple of months ago. So that's the first big contract for Envision in Australia.
I think you want to remind people that the Nabra turbines have this idea of a scaffolding structure that raises itself up. It may not look as beautiful as conventional wind turbines, which I personally think are some of the nicest looking things on the planet. Amazingly sculptured, and but it may be a lot cheaper and a lot faster to do, and certainly needs less concrete if it works. But I don't think it's really been proved at large scale commercially yet, has it, Giles?
No, it hasn't been, and that's the idea, though. Yes, absolutely. It needs less concrete, smaller foundations. It lifts the turbine and the hub height higher, so that gets into better winds. The whole logistics are just are much more simple. Somebody was telling me the other day just about the sort of, the challenges of sort of laying concrete in sort of hot and humid climates, just quite extraordinary, actually. I mean, not just for wind turbines, but just for any sort of civil construction project. And so if you can reduce the amount of concrete that you're laying in a foundation, then that's a good, a cheaper and a cleaner thing.
Hard to argue with that. If you look in China, cement would be about the 4th biggest cause of emissions. We didn't cover it much with Chris Bowen, but it's worthwhile mentioning fairly regularly that whilst one side of the industry, like BlueScope, talks about how important gas is for the energy transmission, transition. The simple fact is you never hear anyone actually say, except on this podcast, of course, or in the science community, that gas is the third biggest form of thermal carbon emissions, and it's growing compound rate. Gas emissions are where coal was about 15 years ago already, and there's no sign of them really slowing down just yet. So there is plenty of good reasons for people to continue to focus on Australia's Scope 3 emissions. But as noble as that task is, our simple job is to get more wind and solar built, get the batteries built, get the home energy built, and get the EV percentage up as high as we can, and let big business follow along and get with the program as well.
Good stuff. David, I think that's probably about a wrap for this week. Thank you very much for holding the fort during the interview with the Minister. And thank you very much, Minister Chris Bowen, for joining us once again. Thanks, of course, to our sponsors, Evergen and Pylon. Thanks to all the listeners out there. Do please give us your feedback. And we look forward to catching up with you again next week. Another episode of Energy Insiders. And that's goodbye from him.
And goodbye from us.